This podcast is brought to you by Knowledge at Wharton. Please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu for more information.
Global automakers, especially the big three, can't seem to catch a break. First, the spike in oil prices last spring and summer. Now the global financial crisis is keeping consumers out of new car markets worldwide. Even Toyota says its year-over-year sales will fall by 2% in 2008, their first sales decline in 7 years. Automakers from emerging markets such as China's Chery and India's Tata, whose growth was fueled by double-digit economic growth, now have to adjust to much more modest gains. The picture is particularly gloomy in Detroit, where, compared to the first 9 months of 2007, sales for the same period this year are down 17.1% for Ford, 17.4% for GM, and 25% for Chrysler. Now, GM and Chrysler are reported to be running out of cash and seeking help from the government, even as they discuss a merger. And Kirk Kerkorian is unwinding his billion-dollar investment in Ford. Could the big three soon become the big two or less? Here to discuss the near-term future of the auto industry are Wharton management professors John Paul McDuffie and Larry Rabiniak. Thanks for joining us, professors. Let's start in the U.S. Why are the big three in such a jam?
They've been hit by more or less the equivalent of a perfect storm, I think, between being still in the midst of a recovery plan, which has included things like reducing labor costs, reducing healthcare and pension costs, trying to shift their product line to more fuel-efficient vehicles. And oil prices obviously hit them in the middle of that. And now the financial crisis, the credit crisis, is causing them to not be able to extend loans to car buyers. They're being hit on all fronts.
Looking back to historically, what John Paul said, of course, is true. I would just add that over the years, probably the last decade or so, they made decade and a half, a lot of strategic mistakes. You know, basically years ago, they had a very favorable industry structure. Industry forces were positive. They had power over suppliers. They had power over buyers. Buyers didn't know much about buying cars. They had size. They had market share. It was an oligopoly, three firms. All of a sudden, the world changes. Competition comes in. The customer gets much more knowledgeable because of the internet. Suppliers become more powerful. The UAW had a history of GM, of course, of bad relationships, and that's not carrying over positively right now. And so when you put all of that in perspective, and given what John Paul also said, that in fact you can see some strategic errors and just an inability to manage their company well.
Well, as we know, GM and Chrysler are talking about merging with each other. Does that make sense?
It's hard to see much strategic rationale for it. Chrysler has access to some cash, which GM could very much use. There's also talk about Cerberus, which owns Chrysler, being able to turn over its ownership stake in the GMAC, the credit arm of GM, as part of that deal. Everything else, which you usually hear when there's talk of merger and acquisition, which is scale economies and synergies and being able to eliminate redundant products and redundant dealers, et cetera. To me, the administrative effort to do that effectively is going to so overwhelm these companies at this point that it would swamp any benefits I think they could get.
And they've been talking about it for some time. So despite that logic, is it likely to turn out that we'll have a big two instead of a big three, and perhaps in the future something even less than that?
Yeah, I would say this is probably going to happen. I agree that basically strategically it doesn't make a lot of sense, yet I look at the other options they have and there aren't that many. If they do merge with Chrysler, they're going to need something like $10 billion of infused equity just to pull off the integration, just to meld the two companies, just to do a whole host of things. There's going to be a bunch of layoffs and whatever, but I don't know what the options are. It's going to happen. I don't think it's a great move, but it's going to happen. I also think it's a signal. I think even though the government has come out and said they're thinking of helping them, I think they want to go through a kind of sequential process that says, look, we've tried to solve our problems. If we integrate two companies now, we're really showing we're trying our best, and if this doesn't work, we can't have so many people be negatively affected in the economy. So government, please step in and help us. And we've tried hard. And so I think that's part of it too. But strategically, one company has 8 brands, the other has 3. You put them together, I mean, we'll have 10,000 plants. That's 10 times more than Toyota. And all of these things put together say, there's a lot of problems.
Now that $10 billion they would need to pull that off, there aren't a lot of lenders lining up to provide the cash. And so there has been talk, as you said, of going to the government for some help. Today the White House said that they would likely qualify for the help under the TARP program. So should the government step in? Should the government save GM?
Well, it's going to be politically complicated, although at the same time there's probably more favorable political conditions for such an action now than the last time it was brought up, which was less than a year ago. I do think that bankruptcy is probably the last option that these companies will want to pursue. For a durable good like a vehicle, for a company to be in bankruptcy introduces so much uncertainty in anyone's purchase decision, even maintaining of used vehicles. It's not like an airline. We've seen airlines go into bankruptcy sometimes twice and come out and still have customers, but I think the feeling is, no one's really tested it, that with a car company it would be very different. So there's the options of big mergers, there's options of smaller things which involve selling off chunks of assets. Ford may sell off its stake in Mazda. There's talk of I don't know whether GM could sell Hummer in this circumstance, but there are things less than the big mergers. And I think the government, which has already approved, I think it's $25 billion for supporting the big three in a conversion to new fuel-efficient technologies, is probably ready to do more. The question would be the conditions. I think Obama has already said that he favors another $25 billion right away and more dedicated to saving jobs. So in a funny way, the conditions are more favorable, but perhaps, as Larry says, there'll be some sort of necessary steps of industry consolidation before that could happen.
Well, certainly the development of those lower emission, more efficient cars are very important for their competition in their competition against overseas manufacturers. Is that going to be enough? That kind of government assistance through the incentives going to be enough to fund that, or do you think that's going to take something more?
It's going to take, I think, something more. If we recall, GM had a very nice electric motor car back in the 60s and 70s, and they killed it because of the reliance on gas combustion, and they basically said, no, we're not going to do this. So now, of course, they're doing it because others are forcing them to do it. Whether they can get up to speed and do it as quickly and get up there with Toyotas and Hondas and so on is yet another question. Should the government bail them out? I don't think the government probably feels they have much choice right now, because they did all this work with all this help for the financial institutions, and the argument was the pervasiveness of the effects, if we let them go under, would be disastrous. Well, the same with General Motors. If you stop and think with General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, the number of people they affect, not only directly in terms of employees, but suppliers, people who work, related industries, the multiplier effect of all the implications of not helping them are going to be huge. So I feel the government's going to feel, we've started the process, we've helped someone else, we're going to have to continue. I think that's what will happen.
Ford doesn't seem to be in quite so deep a hole. Why is that?
Ford? Mm-hmm. They got into a better cash position about a year or so ago. They have some better brands. They do have Volvo, they have Mazda, and they did have some resurgence about a year or so ago after having some pretty down time. Now, they just moved faster than General Motors and Chrysler. The fact that General Motors first picked Ford to look at, because they knew what they were doing. They were saying if anyone could help us, it would be Ford more than Chrysler, quite frankly. But Ford wasn't interested. Now, Ford's in a little bit more trouble because even investors there are pulling out and selling off. And so they might not be in as good a shape as I thought they were just a few months ago. But with their fewer brands, and again, with Mazda and Volvo, they could sell those off, they could keep them. I think they're in a little better shape. Again, GM has 8 major brands. I mean, and with Hummer and some of the things, and the GMC trucks, which are doing nothing right now, and I don't think Ford's in that position.
Well, just last year, Ford sold its Jaguar division and to Tata Motors in India, which makes me wonder, they were kind of counting on it in Tata and at China's automakers for the really fast-growing economies that they had over there. And of course, the financial crisis has put the brakes on that too. What does this mean for them?
Well, their progress is going to be a lot slower. I mean, let's face reality that they had counted on double-digit growth. They had predicted that. Matter of fact, Tata was one of the companies mentioned to pick up some assets from General Motors or even merge with them or buy some of their assets. All of that, I think, is going to be put on back burner. The slowdown in the worldwide economies, the financial crises, it's going to affect Asia. It's going to affect Europe. It's going to affect us here. And I think that they're just going to have to bite the bullet and hopefully things get better.
Yeah, I think the Chinese have shown some interest in buying into companies outside of China and starting to get into those markets before they would be able to export from China directly. But I think that they're going to have to keep their focus on their domestic markets, which will be slowed down. Tata has some demonstrated capabilities of managing these sort of high-end brands that they've purchased, but most of their emphasis is on the Nano, on the product they've developed for their own domestic market. So I expect it to stay that way.
Now, Toyota is reporting this year that they'll have their first decline in sales since 2001. So I guess this means nobody's immune?
Absolutely nobody's immune, and certainly Toyota's decision to invest in the larger pickups and SUVs, they just redesigned the Tundra, they just launched a brand new plant in Texas to build it, means they've been hit with the same kind of steep fall of that end of the market. But of course, that's not a big part of Toyota's product lineup. It's not kind of the core of its strategy. Those are unique products to the U.S. In most of the globe, they really are leaders in fuel-efficient vehicles. You could perhaps argue that Honda has the best product portfolio for these kinds of conditions because they've stayed with a smaller number of products, and almost all of them have some drivetrain innovation because that's really the core of Honda's strategy. So perhaps right now they look in the best situation, but Toyota's cash-rich and they're very flexible and adaptive. They've already announced that they're going to convert an SUV factory plan for Mississippi to build the Prius in the U.S., the first country outside of Japan where that will be built. So I expect that they'll do just fine.
What kind of time frame do you think we're looking at for this this rough patch for the auto industry? Will the auto industry emerge from the financial crisis kind of behind the curve or ahead of the curve, and how long do you think that might be?
Well, I think they're currently behind the curve pretty badly when you look at worldwide sales, comparing them to Toyota, Honda, and some of the others. I think there are two questions here. Number one, will they emerge? And number two, how will they emerge and when? So it's like, I think even if they do emerge, if they get through these financial crises that they're going through now, if there is some sort of merger acquisition activity and whatever, you're not going to see magical results. They're going to be behind the curve and they're going to have to fight very, very hard to fight the erosion in market share, fight the increase in costs. Right now, General Motors is spending over $1 billion more per month than it's bringing in. And so even with a merger, an acquisition, or whatever we might call it, with Chrysler and the need for that extra $10 billion, I don't see things turning around very quickly. I see them really trying to save themselves. And to answer your question, they're going to be behind the curve for quite a long time, quite frankly.
But do you think they can avoid bankruptcy?
They said they were going to do it at all costs. They said there is no option. That could just be good talk. Quite frankly, I'm not sure they can avoid bankruptcy. But it sounds good what they're trying to say to the financial markets, their potential investors, and whatever it is. Please don't give up on us. That in fact, we're not going to go bankrupt. We are going to fight through this. But I think it's going to be tight, very close.
Professor McDuffie, are they going to make it?
I mean, there really are two auto industries in the U.S. by now. There are the U.S.-owned companies, the ones we've always thought of as the big three, but there's by now a very large number of, not only factories, but dealerships of not just Japanese, but Korean, German, and the French may end up with some role here too if they end up with some assets through their own negotiations with GM. So, will there be a thriving U.S. auto industry? It'll be affected by the overall economic conditions. There was a prediction of 15 million vehicles per year as a kind of expected in a moderate recession. GM was basing a lot of its estimates on 14 million. The prediction for 09 is 13 million. So that's a dramatic percentage reduction from what everyone was counting on. How quickly will that come back? How quickly will auto sales come back? That's the kind of purchase that people do postpone when times are tough. They can't postpone forever. They may shift towards used cars and the like. So how quickly sales come back is obviously a big thing that affects both the healthier and the less healthy part of the industry. Whether they go under, I think there will be a lot that happens from the government as well as from these companies to prevent bankruptcy. And I'm still a little skeptical of the big mergers, but I think there'll be lots and lots of assets moving around here before we see the final outcome.
The other thing here to mention, even though we're focusing on the big companies, the big U.S. companies, a lot of dealerships have been going out of business, have been experiencing financial problems. So if you look at the distribution channel, even if all of this, they weather the storm as far as big companies and they have some merger activity or buying of assets, you've got your distribution channel for at least General Motors and Chrysler being hurt. And if, it takes a little while to get that back, if Toyota is still going fairly strong and they have the dealership on the corner selling cars and the dealership across the street is closed down, it's going to take a little bit to get people with money, financing, backing to get the distribution channel back where it was. So probably, there will be an industry. You're right, the foreign companies are going to remain pretty strong. But I think there's going to be a lot of problems.
I have just one thought on the dealership issue. You might think that it's easier to close a dealership than it is to close a giant factory. But in fact, each state has franchise laws, and there's a lot of protections against closing dealers. And as the big three have shrunk, they've had a great difficulty reducing their dealerships proportionate to their drop in sales, which then means everyone is competing for the same smaller number of customers. This kind of a crisis puts a lot of dealers out of business. The bright side is a much more rational dealership structure for these companies, however they emerge.
Well, thanks very much.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information, please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu.